Maya Thompson was a bright 14-year-old girl who loved her hair. It was thick, curly, and full of life, just like her. She took good care of it, spending hours with her mother, Angela, braiding and moisturizing it. Her hair was a part of her identity, something she was proud of. But one day, that pride was shattered. It all started when Maya got into a small argument at school. A classmate had been bothering her for weeks, making fun of her hair and calling it messy. Maya had tried to ignore it, just like her mother had told her. But that day, she couldn't take it anymore. She told the girl to stop, and when the teasing continued, Maya finally stood up for herself. It wasn't a fight, just a heated exchange of words. But the teacher, who had never really liked Maya, sent her straight to the principal's office. The school had a policy of involving the police in student conflicts, no matter how small. That's how Officer Bradley Carter, a strict and cold-hearted man, entered the picture. He had been working in law enforcement for years and had built a reputation for being tough, especially toward kids like Maya. He didn't ask questions. He didn't try to understand. The moment he saw Maya, he made up his mind about her. At the police station, Maya sat in a cold chair, confused and scared. She hadn't done anything wrong, yet she was being treated like a troublemaker. Her mother had been called, but she hadn't arrived yet. That's when Officer Carter walked in, looking at her with disapproval. "Your hair is a mess," he muttered, shaking his head. Maya blinked, unsure of what to say. Before she could react, he grabbed a pair of scissors from his desk. "We need to make you look more presentable," he said, his voice sharp. Maya's heart pounded. "No, please. Don't touch my hair," she begged, gripping the arms of the chair. But Carter didn't listen. With a few harsh snips, Maya's curls fell to the floor. She felt each cut like a wound to her soul. Tears filled her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of him. When he was done, her once beautiful hair was uneven, chopped, and ruined. "There," Carter said, tossing the scissors aside. "That's better." Maya felt like the air had been knocked out of her chest. She couldn't believe what had just happened. No one had ever made her feel so small, so powerless. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but she knew it wouldn't help. By the time her mother arrived, Maya was still sitting in the chair, staring at the floor where her curls lay like fallen leaves. Angela rushed to her daughter, gasping in horror. "What happened?" she demanded. Maya looked up, her eyes filled with silent pain. "He cut my hair," she whispered. Angela's face hardened with anger, her hands trembling. She knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Angela held Maya tightly, running her fingers through the uneven, jagged strands of her once beautiful hair. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to cry in front of the officer. Instead, she took a deep breath and looked straight at him. "You had no right," she said, her voice calm but filled with anger. Officer Carter simply shrugged. "She needed to be cleaned up," he muttered, as if what he had done meant nothing. Angela clenched her fists, her heart pounding. She wanted to scream, to demand justice right then and there, but she knew she had to be careful. She had seen too many cases where speaking up only made things worse. But this was too much. Without another word, she took Maya's hand and walked out of the station, her mind racing with what to do next. When they got home, Maya went straight to her room and shut the door. Angela stood outside, listening to the quiet sobs from inside. Her strong, brave daughter, who rarely cried, was now broken. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Friends, family, and even people who barely knew Maya were shocked and outraged. They gathered at Angela's house, their faces filled with anger and concern. "We need to do something," said Mrs. Johnson, a longtime neighbor. "This can't be ignored." Angela nodded. "I know," she said, her voice firm. "But we have to be smart about it." Meanwhile, Maya sat in front of her mirror, staring at her reflection. Her hair had always been a source of pride, something that made her feel beautiful and strong. Now it was gone, taken from her by someone who didn't care how much it meant to her. She touched the uneven strands, her fingers shaking. It wasn't just about the hair. It was about the way she had been treated, as if she didn't matter. She picked up her phone and took a picture of herself. Then, with a deep breath, she posted it online with a simple message. "This is what was done to me today. This is how they treated me." Within hours, her post had been shared hundreds of times. People from all over started commenting, offering support and expressing their outrage. "This is unacceptable," one person wrote. "We're with you, Maya." Others demanded action, calling for justice. At the police station, Officer Carter saw the news spreading. He frowned, not expecting the backlash. He had done what he thought was right. At least, that's what he told himself. But deep down, a small part of him felt uneasy. Angela, seeing the growing support, knew this wasn't just about Maya anymore. This was about making sure no other child went through the same thing. As she watched the comments pour in, she made a decision. It was time to call Maya's father. Late that evening, Angela sat on the couch, her phone in her hands. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she hesitated for a moment. It had been years since she last spoke to David Thompson, Maya's father. He had always been a man of discipline, honor, and strength, a man who believed in standing up for what was right. But after their separation, he had been away, serving his country, and their communication had grown distant. But now, Maya needed him. Taking a deep breath, Angela finally pressed the call button. It rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "Angela." She swallowed hard. "David, I need you to come home." There was a pause on the other end. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice suddenly serious. Angela's hands clenched into fists as she spoke. "It's Maya. A police officer. He cut her hair, David. He humiliated her. And I don't know what to do." Her voice cracked, and she hated how vulnerable she sounded. Silence. Then, in a calm but firm voice, David said, "I'll be there first thing in the morning." Angela let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you." The next morning, a sleek black SUV pulled up in front of the house. As soon as the door opened, a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out. His posture was straight, his movements controlled. Colonel David Thompson had arrived. Maya, who had barely spoken the night before, peeked out from her room when she heard the sound of the car door closing. She hadn't seen her father in years, and for a moment she wasn't sure what to expect. But as soon as she saw him standing there, his strong presence filling the doorway, a lump formed in her throat. He turned and saw her. His eyes, sharp and observant, softened when they landed on her uneven, chopped hair. He didn't say a word at first, just walked toward her and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Who did this to you?" His voice was quiet, but there was something dangerous underneath it. Maya swallowed hard. "The police officer," she whispered. David's jaw tightened. He looked at Angela, his expression unreadable. "Tell me everything," he said. As Angela explained what had happened, David listened without interrupting. His face remained calm, but his hands curled into fists. When she finished, he nodded once and said, "We're going to fix this." Maya looked up at him, her eyes filled with doubt. "How?" she asked. David met her gaze, his expression fierce. "By making sure he regrets ever laying a hand on you." Angela knew that look. It was the same one he had before every mission, the same quiet determination that made him unstoppable. Officer Carter had no idea what was coming. The next morning, Colonel David Thompson stepped out of the house, his face set like stone. He was a man who had spent years in the military, leading soldiers into battle, making tough decisions, and standing up for what was right. But nothing made his blood boil more than seeing his own daughter hurt and humiliated. This wasn't just about Maya's hair. This was about dignity, respect, and justice. Dressed in his sharp, well-pressed uniform, he drove straight to the police station. As soon as he walked in, every officer in the room turned to look at him. There was something about his presence, calm, commanding, and unshaken, that made people stand up a little straighter. Officer Bradley Carter was sitting at his desk, casually sipping his coffee when he saw the tall, strong man walking toward him. At first, he didn't recognize him, but when David stopped right in front of him and locked eyes with him, Carter felt an unexpected shiver run down his spine. "Are you Officer Carter?" David asked, his voice low and firm. Carter leaned back in his chair, trying to act unfazed. "Yeah, that's me. And you are?" David pulled out his military ID and placed it on the desk. "Colonel David Thompson, Maya Thompson's father." For the first time, Carter hesitated. He had heard the name before. He had read about Colonel Thompson, highly decorated, respected, a man who had trained some of the best soldiers in the country. Carter forced a smirk. "Look, Colonel, I was just doing my job. Your daughter was causing trouble, and I handled the situation." David didn't blink. "Handled the situation," he repeated slowly. "You humiliated a young girl. You abused your position. And now you're going to answer for it." The room had gone completely silent. Other officers stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation. Even the police chief had stepped out of his office, sensing that something serious was unfolding. Carter sat up straighter. "Are you threatening me?" he asked, trying to sound confident, but his voice wavered slightly. David leaned in just a little, his eyes locked onto Carter's. "No," he said. "I don't make threats. I take action." At that moment, the police chief walked over. "Colonel Thompson, let's take this conversation somewhere private," he said, trying to diffuse the tension. David straightened. "Good idea," he said, "because this isn't just a personal matter anymore. This is about accountability. And trust me, I have the connections to make sure this department answers for what happened." Carter swallowed hard, suddenly realizing that the situation was far from over. As David followed the chief into his office, Carter wiped his hands on his pants. For the first time in his career, he felt something he never expected: fear. Inside the police chief's office, Colonel David Thompson sat across from Chief Reynolds, his expression calm but unshakable. The chief knew exactly why David was here, and he could already feel the pressure building. This wasn't just an angry parent demanding justice. This was a man with power, influence, and experience in handling difficult situations. "I read the report," the chief started, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "Officer Carter claims he was maintaining discipline." David leaned forward, his sharp eyes focused. "Cutting my daughter's hair wasn't discipline. It was humiliation. It was abuse. And if you let this slide, I promise you, Chief, this story will reach places you don't want it to." The chief sighed, rubbing his forehead. He had seen the outrage spreading online. Maya's story was being shared thousands of times, and people were already calling for an investigation. The mayor's office had reached out earlier, concerned about the negative attention. Now, sitting across from Colonel Thompson, he knew this wasn't something that could be ignored. David continued, his voice steady. "I've already spoken to my legal team. Civil rights lawyers are looking into this. Federal agencies will be informed. I have contacts in high places. Chief, if this department wants to keep its reputation, you'll take action now." The chief shifted in his seat. "What exactly are you asking for?" David's gaze didn't waver. "Officer Carter needs to be held accountable. Not a suspension, not a warning, real consequences. And I expect a public statement from this department addressing what happened to my daughter." Outside the office, Carter sat nervously at his desk. He had never thought twice about his actions before. To him, Maya was just another kid who needed to be put in her place. But now he realized he had made a serious mistake. His heart pounded as he overheard whispers among his colleagues. Some officers glanced at him, shaking their heads. The department was under a microscope now, and everyone knew it. His once confident smirk had disappeared. After what felt like an eternity, the chief's door opened. Colonel Thompson walked out first, his face unreadable. The chief followed, looking more serious than ever. He glanced at Carter, and motioned for him to come into the office. As Carter stood, his stomach twisted. He could feel the weight of what was coming. The department was turning against him. The media was watching. And worst of all, he had crossed the wrong man. David didn't look back as he walked out of the station. His job wasn't done yet, but he had set things in motion. Maya deserved justice, and he would make sure she got it. Meanwhile, Carter sat down in front of the chief, his palms sweaty. For the first time in his career, he was no longer the one in control. Officer Carter sat stiffly in the police chief's office, his hands clasped together as if holding on to the last bit of control he had. Chief Reynolds leaned back in his chair, staring at him for a long moment before finally speaking. "This is bad, Carter," the chief said, his voice heavy with frustration. "Really bad." Carter cleared his throat, trying to sound confident. "Chief, I was just..." The chief cut him off. "No, don't explain. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you've brought on this department? Colonel Thompson is not just some angry parent. He has connections, real connections. His name alone is enough to get federal attention on us. And on top of that, the public is furious. There are people outside right now protesting." Carter's stomach dropped. He had expected some backlash, but not this. "Protesting," he repeated. The chief nodded. "Yes, and the mayor's office called this morning. They want an immediate response." He sighed, shaking his head. "I don't know what made you think cutting that girl's hair was acceptable, but you've put us all in a terrible position." Carter swallowed hard. "So, what happens now?" The chief folded his arms. "You're being placed on unpaid leave, effective immediately. And that's just the beginning. An internal investigation is already underway, and if they find what I think they will, you could lose your badge permanently." Carter's mouth went dry. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had been with the department for years, always doing things his way, never facing real consequences. But now, for the first time, he felt powerless. "Chief, please," he started, but the chief raised a hand to silence him. "You did this to yourself, Carter," he said. "Now get out of my office." Carter stood slowly, his legs feeling weak. Without another word, he walked out, his mind racing. As he passed through the station, he noticed how quiet it had become. Officers who once laughed and joked with him now avoided his eyes. He wasn't just in trouble, he was being abandoned. Meanwhile, outside the station, the protest had grown larger. Dozens of people held signs demanding justice for Maya. Reporters were setting up cameras, waiting for an official statement. David and Angela stood in the crowd, watching as people chanted Maya's name. Angela squeezed David's hand. "It's working," she whispered. David nodded but didn't relax. "It's not over yet," he said. Inside the house, Maya watched the protests on TV. She couldn't believe how many people cared about what had happened to her. For the first time since that horrible day, she felt a spark of hope. She reached up and touched her uneven hair, then took a deep breath. Maybe, just maybe, things were finally changing. The days that followed were a blur for Maya and her family. The protests outside the police station continued to grow, and soon, news outlets from all over the country began reporting on the incident. Maya's face appeared on TV screens, in newspapers, and across social media. People everywhere were talking about the injustice she had suffered. But while the public outcry was growing, there was still the matter of Officer Carter's future. The internal investigation had begun, and though it would take time, the pressure on the police department was mounting. One afternoon, a week after the incident, Maya and Angela received a call. It was from the police chief. "Maya, Angela, I want to meet with you both," he said, his voice serious. "Please come down to the station. We've made some decisions." Maya's heart raced. She wasn't sure if she was ready to face the police again, but she knew that this was important. Angela squeezed her hand, offering silent reassurance. At the police station, the atmosphere was different. The usual noise and chatter were replaced by a tense silence as Maya and Angela walked into the chief's office. David had stayed home, letting Angela handle the meeting. The chief stood up as they entered. "I won't waste your time," he said. "Officer Carter has been suspended indefinitely. The investigation is ongoing, but based on what we've seen so far, it's clear that his actions were not just an error in judgment, but a violation of department policy. We are also moving forward with retraining all officers on cultural sensitivity and abuse of power." Maya looked at Angela, both of them processing the news. The chief's words felt like a small victory, but Maya knew that the road to true change was just beginning. "There's more," the chief added, his voice softer now. "I'm deeply sorry for what happened to your daughter, Maya. It should never have occurred. This department is committed to doing better, and I want you to know that we are taking steps to regain the trust of the community." Angela nodded, but there was still a knot in her stomach. "What about Carter?" she asked. The chief hesitated. "We are working with the mayor's office to ensure that this situation is handled appropriately. While I can't speak to the final outcome yet, we will make sure that he faces the consequences of his actions." Maya took a deep breath. "What happens now?" she asked. The chief smiled faintly. "Now we work to fix what's broken, but it's going to take time." As they left the station, Maya felt a weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't over, but for the first time since that terrible day, she felt like something real was being done to right the wrong. The protests, the media coverage, the conversations, it was all working. But there was still one thing that Maya knew deep down. This wasn't just about her. It was about the countless others who had been hurt by the same system. She wanted to be part of the change, to make sure no one else would ever have to face what she had. And with that resolve in her heart, she took the first step toward becoming the voice of those who couldn't speak up. The story of Maya Thompson had just begun. Months passed after the incident, and Maya slowly started to feel more like herself again. Though the scars of what had happened still lingered, both physically and emotionally, she was beginning to heal. She had been through something that no one should have to endure, but she had also found a strength within herself that she hadn't known was there. The protests had led to real change. Officer Carter had been fired from the department, and though it wasn't an easy decision for the police chief, it was the right one. The department had launched new initiatives to improve cultural sensitivity and address abuse of power. The department's commitment to regaining the trust of the community was a slow process, but it was a step in the right direction. Maya's story had sparked conversations across the country. Her bravery in sharing her experience had inspired others to speak out about injustices they had faced. It wasn't just about her hair anymore. It was about something much bigger. One afternoon, Maya was invited to speak at a community event. It was the first time she had been asked to speak publicly, and while she felt nervous, she knew it was important. When she arrived, she was greeted by a sea of familiar faces. There were people from her school, her neighborhood, and even strangers who had heard her story and wanted to show their support. As she took the stage, she looked out at the crowd, feeling a surge of gratitude and determination. She cleared her throat and began to speak. "When this all started, I didn't know what would happen," she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I didn't know if anyone would believe me. I didn't know if things would change, but you all made sure they did. You made sure my voice was heard, and you made sure that what happened to me didn't go unnoticed." She paused, looking out at the crowd. "I know that my story isn't unique. There are so many others who have been hurt in ways that no one should be, and that's why we need to keep fighting for change. Not just for me, but for everyone." The crowd erupted into applause, and Maya felt a wave of relief wash over her. She was no longer the scared girl hiding in her room. She was the voice of change, and it felt powerful. Back home that evening, Angela and David sat with her, both proud of how far she had come. "You've done something incredible, Maya," Angela said, her eyes filled with tears. "You've shown the world your strength." David nodded, his hand on Maya's shoulder. We're all so proud of you. You've turned this pain into purpose." Maya smiled, feeling a warmth in her heart. She knew that the journey was far from over, but she also knew that she was no longer walking it alone. With the support of her family, her community, and the people who had rallied around her, she was ready to keep fighting for justice. Her story wasn't just about what happened that day. It was about the power of standing up, speaking out, and demanding change. Maya had shown that even the smallest voice could make the biggest difference, and now her voice would never be silenced again. As the sun set outside their home, Maya knew that no matter what came next, she would always be strong enough to face it. She had found her purpose, and nothing could take that away.